May 19th, 1536, Tower of London. A French swordsman stands ready with his blade. In moments, he will perform the most shocking execution in English history. The victim is not a traitor, not a criminal, not an enemy of the state. The victim is the Queen of England herself, Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry VIII destroyed his relationship with Rome, created his own church, and defied the Pope himself, is about to lose her head. But how did the king's great love become his greatest enemy in just 3 short years? The answer reveals the true monster that Henry had become. A man so obsessed with male heirs that he would commit the ultimate crime, the execution of his own wife. If you think you know the story of Anne Boleyn, think Anne, because the truth is far more terrifying than any fairy tale. Subscribe now, because we're about to witness the moment Henry crossed a line that even tyrants fear to cross. 1533 to 1536, Anne Boleyn's reign as Queen of England. Just 1,000 days, but in that brief time, she would experience the highest heights of power and the lowest depths of terror that any woman in history had ever known. It began with triumph. Anne's coronation in June 1533 was the most magnificent ceremony England had seen in decades. Henry spared no expense to show Europe that his new queen was legitimate, worthy, and blessed by God himself. But even on her coronation day, there were ominous signs. The crowds that lined the streets to watch Anne's procession were notably silent. No cheers, no celebration. These were people who had loved Catherine of Aragon, who saw Anne as nothing more than the king's whore who had stolen the crown, and herself seemed oblivious to the hostility. She was young, beautiful, and carrying what she was certain would be Henry's long-awaited son. She had won the greatest prize in Europe. She was Queen of England. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. September 7th, 1533, and gave birth to her first child. Henry had been so confident the baby would be male that he had already prepared proclamations announcing the birth of a prince. Instead, the midwife delivered devastating news. Another daughter. The child was named Elizabeth. And while history would eventually remember Elizabeth as one of England's greatest monarchs, in 1533 she represented nothing but failure. Henry's break from Rome, his defiance of the Pope, his destruction of English monasteries, all of it had been justified by his need for a male heir, and Anne Boleyn had failed to provide one. Henry's reaction was immediate and chilling. The lavish celebrations planned for the birth of a prince were cancelled. The king barely visited Anne during her recovery. Courtiers noted that Henry seemed almost disgusted by the sight of his newborn daughter. But Anne was young and fertile. There would be other pregnancies, other chances for sons, at least. That's what everyone hoped. Anne became pregnant again. Henry's spirits lifted slightly. Perhaps the first birth had been God's way of testing his faith. This time, surely, Anne would deliver the prince England needed. The pregnancy ended in miscarriage. A male child, lost in the early months. Henry's disappointment was visible to the entire court. Whispers began that perhaps God was still punishing the king for his defiance of Rome. Anne grew desperate. She had seen what happened to Catherine of Aragon when she failed to produce sons. She had witnessed Henry's capacity for cruelty firsthand. She knew that queens who couldn't secure the succession faced a very uncertain future. Another pregnancy, another miscarriage, this time, and lost the child so early that many at court began to question whether she had ever been truly pregnant at all. Was the queen lying about her pregnancies to buy herself more time? Henry's behavior toward Anne began to change dramatically. The passionate love letters stopped. The romantic gestures disappeared. The king who had once written, "I beseech you to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us," now barely spoke to his wife, except when protocol demanded it. More ominously, Henry began paying attention to other women at court. Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, caught the king's eye. She was everything and was not. Quiet where Anne was outspoken, submissive where Anne was challenging, and most importantly, she was willing to learn from Anne's mistakes, and watched in growing horror as Henry's attention shifted to Jane. She had seen this pattern before, when Henry had grown tired of Catherine and begun pursuing her, but Anne had assumed that her intelligence, her wit, Her ability to challenge the king intellectually would keep him interested longer than it had Catherine. She was wrong. Henry didn't want a partner. He wanted a broodmare who could produce sons. And Anne Boleyn was failing in the only task that truly mattered to him. January 1536, and discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy would determine her fate. If she delivered a son, she would be safe. If she delivered another daughter, or lost the child entirely, Henry's patience would finally be exhausted. The pressure was enormous. Anne's every movement was monitored. Her diet was controlled. She was forbidden from dancing, riding, or engaging in any activity that might endanger the pregnancy. For a woman accustomed to being the center of attention, the enforced isolation was maddening. January 29, 1536, news reached the court that would change everything. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, had died in exile. Anne's reaction was telling. Instead of relief that her rival was finally gone, and seemed almost terrified by the news, she understood what Catherine's death meant. Henry was now free to remarry without any complications about his previous marriages. If Anne failed to produce a son, Henry could simply have her annulled and start fresh with a new wife. Catherine's death had made inexpendable the pregnancy. That should have been Anne's salvation became her doom. In late January 1536, she miscarried again. But this miscarriage was different, and claimed she had lost a son, a male child who would have secured her position forever. Henry's reaction was swift and brutal. He visited Anne only once after the miscarriage, and his words were like ice. "I see that God will not give me male children," he said coldly. "When you are up, I will speak to you." Those words were Anne's death sentence. Henry had already decided that his marriage to Anne was cursed, just as his marriage to Catherine had been cursed. And if Anne's marriage was invalid, then her execution for adultery would not be regicide. It would be justice. The charges against Anne Boleyn were so preposterous that they would have been laughable if they weren't so deadly. Adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother George, treason against the king, plotting Henry's death. The evidence was non-existent. The accusations were clearly fabricated. But Henry had learned something important during his break from Rome. Truth was whatever the king said it was. And if Henry said Anne was guilty, then she was guilty. April 30th, 1536, and was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same tower where she had stayed before her coronation, where she had prepared for her moment of triumph. Now she was a prisoner, waiting for a trial whose outcome had already been determined. The speed of Anne's fall was breathtaking. Just days earlier, she had been Queen of England. Now she was a condemned traitor. Henry didn't even wait for her trial to begin courting Jane Seymour openly. The message was clear, and was already dead to him. May 2nd, 1536, Anne's alleged lovers were tried first. All were found guilty. All were sentenced to death. The most tragic was Henry Norris, one of Henry's oldest friends, who went to his execution still protesting his innocence. May 15th, 1536, Anne's own trial. She was charged with adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence against her was laughable. Witnesses claimed she had committed adultery in places where she hadn't even been present. Dates didn't match. Stories contradicted each other. But none of that mattered. Anne's fate had been sealed the moment Henry decided he wanted Jane Seymour. The trial was just theater, a legal veneer over what was essentially judicial murder, and defended herself with dignity and intelligence. She denied all charges. She pointed out the inconsistencies in the evidence. She reminded the court that she was their anointed queen, but she was speaking to men who knew their own lives depended on giving Henry the verdict he wanted. Guilty on all charges, death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Henry chose beheading, but even in this, he had a particular cruelty in mind. Instead of the traditional axe used for English executions, Henry imported a French swordsman. The execution would be carried out with a sword. In the French manner, a final insult to the woman who had once been proud of her French education and sophistication. May 19th, 1536, Anne's final morning. She had spent the night in prayer, attended by her chaplain and a few loyal ladies. She had maintained her innocence to the end. But she had also accepted her fate with remarkable composure and chose her final outfit carefully, a gray gown with a white cape symbolizing her innocence. Her hair was pinned up to expose her neck for the sword. She had even practiced the proper way to kneel for her execution. Determined to die with dignity even if she couldn't live with safety, the execution was set for 9 in the morning. But Henry, with characteristic cruelty, delayed it for hours and was forced to wait, knowing that each moment might be her last, not knowing when the final summons would come. Finally, at noon, and was led to the scaffold that had been erected. On Tower Green, a small crowd of nobles had gathered to witness the execution of England's queen. Many were the same courtiers who had bowed to her just months earlier. Anne's final speech was carefully crafted. She could not proclaim her innocence too forcefully, for fear that Henry would take revenge on her daughter Elizabeth. Instead, she spoke of her loyalty to the king and asked for prayers for his welfare. "Good Christian people," she said, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die." It was a masterpiece of careful wording, and managed to maintain her dignity without directly challenging Henry's verdict, protecting her daughter while preserving what little remained of her reputation, and then removed her headdress and cape, revealing her neck to the executioner. She knelt upright, her hands clasped in prayer, her eyes blindfolded. The French swordsman raised his blade. "Jesus, receive my soul," and whispered. With one swift stroke, it was over, and Boleyn, Queen of England, was dead at the age of just 35. The woman for whom Henry had defied the Pope, broken from Rome, and created his own church, had been executed like a common criminal. Henry's reaction to Anne's death was perhaps the most chilling detail of all. Within hours of her execution, he was openly celebrating his engagement to Jane Seymour. The next day, he was married. He showed no grief, no regret, no second thoughts about having murdered his wife. This was the final transformation of Henry VIII. The Golden Prince was long dead. The passionate young king was gone. In his place stood a monster who would kill anyone, even his own wives, who stood between him and his desires, and Boleyn's execution established a precedent that would haunt Henry's future wives. Queens were no longer sacred. They were expendable, and if they failed to provide male heirs, or if Henry simply grew tired of them, the Tower of London and the executioner's block awaited. But Anne's greatest revenge was one she would never live to see. Her daughter Elizabeth, the child whose birth had so disappointed Henry, would grow up to become the greatest monarch in English history. Elizabeth would rule for 45 years, defeat the Spanish Armada, and establish England as a global power. The daughter Henry considered worthless would prove to be worth more than all of his male heirs combined. Next time, we'll witness Henry's brief moment of happiness. Jane Seymour will finally give him the son he craved. But even this triumph will come at a terrible price, and Henry will learn that getting what you want is sometimes the most dangerous thing of all.